to try to get people thinking on a common wavelength. And now we find ourselves sort of reiterating the very pearls of wisdom we tried to drop throughout the meeting, now at the end of the meeting, which is all right. It maybe reinforces some points, but it takes the uniqueness out of what we might have otherwise said. The other point is, I think Kerry's elaboration is so elegant that it really would be better on the website if my talk came first and then Kerry's, because Kerry's takes things so much further in a much more eloquent way than I have been able to do. Now, my theme is the so what. Most of you are very, very elegant speakers. You're very, very good researchers. You're very, very careful scientists. At the end of the day, all of us are human beings that belong to one or more societies, a local society, a national society, and a global society. And in that sense, we have a responsibility beyond just looking at our peers to say, am I saying things that you would agree with? Or am I saying things that stimulate your thought? We should be saying things that, in a way, influence the way people make choices about the future, about their conduct at an individual level or their conduct within a society. And I think Kerry very eloquently made that point. Most of us here in this room were trained in the scientific method. It starts with curiosity. It has to have an element of rigor so that what we do can be traced in a logical way so that people can understand how we put our arguments together. And then we apply that curiosity and rigor to some form of investigation about an interesting challenge that we feel may enliven our lives and perhaps inform other people as well. And then we have to go through very careful analyses to make sure that we've thought about things in a careful way, that our analysis can be substantiated, and that the analysis will provide information that is of value to people beyond our own interest. But that requires a level of interpretation. How do we interpret very complex biological information, social information, and how do we interpret it across disciplines? You know, what does a figure in biology, such as some sort of quotient, how does that significantly influence anybody who isn't a biologist? You know, how do we reach out and communicate more effectively with people? And that is, to me, the key question in communication, to try to illustrate the so what of all our careful biology, all our careful chemistry, all our careful geology, and so forth. It has to mean something to people beyond the individual or that peer group. So, in that sense, although we face major challenges in trying to interpret the world around us, we have an even greater challenge, I believe, in trying to communicate that knowledge, the implications of that knowledge in terms of social choice. So we ask ourselves, who are we trying to communicate with and for what purpose? As scientists, we tend to be dominated by the peer review process. As long as our peers are happy, then we feel secure in our discipline. Once we go beyond certain boundaries, we start to feel insecure, and people will challenge our integrity, our rigor, and our analysis. But I think that's something we need to do. I think perhaps the greatest advances in science are when people have broken the mold. They've moved beyond the conventional. They've explored ideas that perhaps have not been thought through carefully enough by others. So in effect, going to Charles Darwin or any of these other great scientists, they have influenced the way people think about the world around them. And I think the Loicz program has that great opportunity. And that's why I'm basically creating this talk around the concept of, you know, how do you communicate the value of Loicz science to say the so what? Why does it make a difference? How can it inform better social choice? In that sense, I asked the question in the new Loicz, what it is that we're trying to do. What are we trying to communicate? Now, there is a legacy, I believe, quite a rich legacy from the first phase of Loicz. There was 10 years of curiosity-driven research. There were 10 years of people seeking to communicate across disciplines and trying, in the last gasp of the first phase, to create a synthesis of what we had found and trying to communicate that across the disciplines. It was not easy, but I do believe that trying to create that synthesis of 10 years of research did have a major effect in the way we've shaped the science plan for Loicz 2 and the move towards more social and economic disciplines integrating into the Loicz program. So there was, I believe, quite a strong heritage, and a heritage that we have been able to build upon, and we should respect that and take that forward. So the new science plan perhaps has new objectives, more social transformation of information into indications for social choice. We have stronger links with the International Human Dimensions Program. We have developed regional nodes so that there is regional reality being brought into a transnational type of program. Now, those regional nodes will benefit from the heritage, but will also bring a new dimension to that heritage, which is perhaps more attuned to the regional scales that Kerry was talking about in terms of seeking regionally orientated sustainability, if that's the way we go. But there's still questions in my mind, and I'm sure they've been brought up in this meeting, about the links to policy. You know, what is the most effective way to provide information that will influence policy? And how are we going to influence decision-making on an incremental basis? And how are we going to look at how we invest in improving human conduct? The very points that Kerry has so eloquently brought out. And these are the elements we need to think about in communicating the so what to other people. Now, I think Bill Dennison and others have done a great job in trying to take complex ideas through graphics such as this to communicate the complexity of the coastal zone. We've seen, really interesting questions examined, such as the whole issue of storage of water on land and how this is affecting the flow of water through catchments to marine and coastal systems. We've seen, related to that, an assessment of what the changes in the sediment budgets of river systems. And of course, one of the key points that came out of these studies is that we should spend less time worrying about the Orinoco and the Mississippi and give much more attention to the medium, small size catchments, because these are the ones where dynamic change is so rapid and where it has such an immediate effect upon local and regional ecosystems, and you scale that up to the national, international level, and then you see what a major change has taken place in coastal systems due to the need to capture water and how that has changed sediment, energy, and nutrient budgets in coastal systems, a theme that we've talked about throughout this workshop. Another point that's come out of this is not just the surface water that is very important, it is the groundwater recharge rates and the infiltration of fresh water from the coastal zone into the marine system. Again, that's a new dimension very carefully studied under Loicz and part of the heritage that helps us explain the dynamics of change in coastal and nearshore marine systems. Now, we did produce this synthesis, the coastal fluxes in the Anthropocene. But in doing so, it was quite difficult to get the different working groups and research leaders to distill from their 10 years of work the so what in terms of the implications for the global systems and society in different regions. It was difficult because people often hadn't been asked that very same question. It's almost like saying to a scientist, you've got 5 minutes with the President of the United States. What do you think you need to tell him that may change the conduct in that society? That's a very difficult thing to do if you're thinking about your peers and your equations and so forth and so on. It's the so what is not easy to define and it's not easy to identify. I do believe that in trying to do that, though it was a struggle, we have brought together in the synthesis volume a very, very strong body of scientific knowledge and understanding. And in trying to write Chapter 5, which was the syntheses of the syntheses, we did attempt to move forward to inform the new science plan, but also to reach out to a broader community who might come across this book. And I've had quite a lot of very favorable comments from people from different disciplines in different parts of the world saying that that book was actually instrumental in changing the way they thought. And it created an integration of science, both the natural sciences and social sciences, which they felt provided a lead towards their application of science in their own situations. But at the same time, we talk about outputs, a book. We talk about outcomes. What has really changed because of that book? That's very difficult to measure. And all I can say is I can only measure it in the influence it has had upon people's thinking and how they apply their science to the next challenge in the coastal region. But it's a heritage that is very valuable. Nonetheless, Loicz is working in a broad scientific community where there have been many different forms of investigation into coastal and terrestrial to marine relationships. You've had Loicz, you've had hill-to-ocean type programs and so forth, erosion, Eurocoast, Spicosa. They're all innovative types of research funded in many cases from the European Commission or within partnerships amongst different nations. But at the same time, for all of this science, we see new legislation coming out in Europe and to other parts of the world, such as the Integrated Coastal Zone Recommendation. This is a normative statement by the European Commission saying all member states should seek to improve the management of their coasts. Should seek to. They're not being commanded to, as you would be having in a directive. It's a normative type of activity. Perhaps we weren't good enough in translating our science into social choice issues that might have made the coastal recommendation a stronger instrument for change. At the same time, we seem to see an integrating type of policy, such as the Water Framework Directive, which is trying to look at water catchments, looking at water quality, water quantity, and so forth. Good stuff, helps relate the terrestrial and the marine environment in science. But then we turned our backs on the coast. We now have a European marine strategy. And that marine strategy is largely divorced from the land-ocean interactions that we've been studying in Loicz. So in some ways, the outcomes of the Loicz program and Loicz and others haven't been as strong as we might have hoped. And we need to avoid that happening in the second phase of Loicz. A large investment, a lot of people spending a lot of their careers trying to enhance scientific knowledge. But we still need to demonstrate the so what. Now, that, in a way, is something that troubles all of us, because we are convinced that the land-ocean interactions in the coastal zone is a leading question in terms of the change in human society, the opportunities that we will have, the costs that we will incur, the costs that we will transfer to our children, our great-grandchildren, and so on. So the so what has to be thought about every day in Loicz. How do you communicate this? How do you bring together the different elements of science to create a much more effective form of communication that has a greater impact upon policy, decision-making, management, and so forth, even individual conduct of individual groups? Now, when we talk about the coast, we're talking about the most complex region of the world. It is the most integrated and complex form of ecosystem relationships, as well as the socio-economic relationships related to those resource opportunities on the coast. Why are so many of the people on the coast? Because the opportunities are so much greater on the coast than they are in the mountains or in the deep sea. So the resource opportunities are there, and that stimulates the complexity of human development. But what we have seen is management is largely orientated to sectoral economic interests, and often is reactive and defensive. In other words, trying to create exclusive use, stop other people polluting your patch, and so forth and so on. It hasn't had vision. It hasn't had a strong sense of direction. So in that sense, to complement that complexity, we need both good science, but we also need to say the so what to inform better management systems. And that's where the integration of human societies with ecosystems is such a critical organizing point to consider. And that really requires a level of understanding of interconnectedness, interdependence, and understanding of processes and functions of coastal systems, which, in a way, we've undervalued, as Kerry has pointed out, and we've underrepresented in decisions at global level, national level, and to some extent more local level. We've started in Loicz and other programs by saying, all right, if we're interested in fisheries or other specific form of resource, which coastal ecosystem is important? We asked the wrong question. We should have been saying, how does this complex coastal ecosystem, made up of many different subsystems, actually create the opportunities for fisheries to be sustained by good management? So we have moved from breaking science down in a reductionist way to looking at how systems, in a way, nest and together form interdisciplinary interconnectedness and so forth. Now, this diagram we've used in the workshop. It's not a new diagram. It's one I developed a while back. I still find it useful because at the beginning of our thinking about how systems operate, we have to think about what do we include in the system. And in this case, we have made man an essential element in the coastal ecosystem. It doesn't matter if it's a marsh, a salt marsh, a mangrove swamp, or coral reef, whatever you like. There are certain basic environmental processes which have been carefully explored through the first phase of Loicz, such as hydrology, material flows, nutrient flows, and energy, which are essential to the maintenance of the health and productivity of an individual ecosystem. Now, from a natural sciences viewpoint, we interpret the ecosystem functions. These would be primary and secondary productivity, perhaps assimilation of organic waste. Many of these functions are part of the ecosystem. But then what is equally important is to understand how man interprets those resources, those functions in terms of the resources that may be generated. For example, a very valuable nursery ground to support a fish stock, such as the Wadden Sea, not too far from here. That is a major nursery ground, spawning area, and feeding area for fish stocks that are captured beyond the Wadden Sea in the North Sea. So in that sense, the functions of nursery ground, food exchange, and so forth are fundamental to maintaining the fish stocks that we see as a resource. But another key feature of coastal systems is that there are a great number of functions that they serve, and therefore there can be a great number of different resource interpretations of what those functions can offer to human beings. Maybe it's waste assimilation by using, say, reed beds as a way of creating tertiary treatment for sewage. Perhaps the fisheries, perhaps amenity values such as a coastal landscape. These are all things that integrate human interactions with the ecosystem and the ecosystem's response to those interrelationships. And what we find as we move further to the right of this diagram is that the complexity of human interactions in coastal systems is so much greater than, say, in the mountainous areas or the deep marine areas. Therefore, we have this intensity of human use, competition for, and often exclusive use of the coastal resource base, which in economic terms can mean that we don't use it effectively. We don't optimize the potential social benefits from that. But again, if we look to the right of the diagram, the interpretation of the functions, what Kerry will term as ecosystem services, these could be direct services or indirect services, these are really the realm of the social scientist trying to interpret these phenomena. Whereas how the system functions and what is key in maintaining its health and productivity is more the realm of the natural sciences. What is really important now is to consider the feedback of how we use, how we value, and how we interpret the coastal resource system in terms of how it affects the hydrology, material flows, and so forth. So there is a feedback loop for this.